Ladies and gentlemen, dames en heren, van harte welkom. Welcome to the college tour Evgeny Morozov. Both Evgeny Morozov and the moderator of today, Mirko Tobias Schäfer, are here. Please give them a warm applause. Let me briefly introduce to you today's moderator, Mirko Tobias Schäfer. He's an assistant professor of the Master of Digital Cultures, the Master of New Media and Digital Cultures, sorry. And he works for the Utrecht Data School. Today's session is part of the Residencies in Utrecht program. And we arranged this in a living room setting. So please come close if you're sitting behind. Don't be afraid. Get close to our guest of tonight, because this will be a lively, intimate, and informal question and answer and interview session with Evgeny Morozov. We will screen 3 short clips that we selected to introduce the work of Evgeny Morozov and his ideas that we will screen now, and after that Mirko Tobias Schäfer will take over and guide you through the event. Thanks.
We want to build apps that can fix everything. We want an app for problems that we previously used to tackle through politics. We want apps to fix education. We want to fix apps to fix health. We want apps to fix climate change. We want apps to fix all the problems that we are unable to tackle collectively. And while I think that there is much good that can come out from technology and innovation, this way of solving problems through apps does have significant political consequences. And I think we have to think about them before we embark on this quest to essentially apply this logic of commercial innovation to attack problems that so far have been tackled very differently and very often through non-market logics. In as much as you accept the premise that there is something called algorithmic ideology or big data ideology, I'm extremely skeptical that there is any value in trying to debunk it. And I think there is very little value in trying to debunk it for the sole reason that the people implementing a specific project based on that ideology are not acting in good faith. They're not driven by any kind of Habermasian force of the better argument. There is no way you're going to go and explain to them that if only they had read more Deleuze or Foucault, they would design better algorithms or databases.
Just to give an example from Iran, we all heard about the Twitter revolution that happened there, right? But if you look close enough, you'll actually see that many of the networks and blogs and Twitter and Facebook were actually operational, right? They may have become slower, but activists could still access it. And I actually argue that having access to them is actually great for many authoritarian states, right? And it's great simply because they can gather open source intelligence. Right? In the past, it would take you weeks, if not months, to identify how Iranian activists connect to each other. Now you actually know how they connect to each other by looking at the Facebook page. I mean, KGB, and not just KGB, used to torture in order to actually get this data. Now it's all available online.
Welcome. We've just seen 3 clips that are representative for 3 statements Evgeny Morozov had made in the past and is working on. Hailing from Belarus, Evgeny Morozov studied at the American University in Bulgaria. He became a fellow at Stanford University. He lived briefly for 3 years in Berlin and various other places. He's a commuter between the United States and Europe, and he has developed a very strong voice on criticizing not only technology. He actually refuses to be called an internet skeptic, but actually the political discourses revolving around the technologies we're using. On the one hand, the uncritical embracing of technology as the solution to our basic social problems. On the other, the way Silicon Valley or companies, monopolistic companies, are introducing new services and taking over some of the traditional aspects of the welfare state, also a construct that is heavily criticized by Mr. Morozov. We can briefly reflect on his development by looking on his 2 best-selling books. The first one addressed digital dictatorship, And the net delusion addressed how we in the Western countries are praising internet freedom, while the same technologies we were so happy about were used by dictators to introduce repressive means of governance. The second book is To Click Here, to Solve Everything, Click Here, is addressing the unreflected solutionism, the technological solutionism, as you call it, where we invest our hopes that the problems we have will be solved by an app. So if you invade Iraq and download a democracy app, there will most likely not democracy unfolding. Recently, Morozov works on the changes that are taking place in the Western world, where the crumbling welfare states are retreating, and intelligent companies are promising to step in and take over traditional services of the welfare state. He was addressing most prominently Silicon Valley yesterday, but Silicon Valley is actually only a variable. You've seen other constructs in the past and we'll see other constructs in the future doing pretty much the same. What we see is that politics is not only losing the aspect of politics, but also its sovereignty to companies that are increasingly taking over things that were reserved for the sovereign, for the governor in the past. The discussion yesterday on the presentation by Morozov ended with 3 possible outcomes out of this situation. So I would like to invite Evgeny Morozov to briefly recapture those 3 possible outcomes of the current situation, and then we will engage in a discussion and quickly open it up to our audience.
Sure. Thanks for this introduction and thanks for coming. I'd just like to specify that the 3 options I presented yesterday were not just 3 possible outcomes of the current political predicament. I mean, there, the sky is the limit. You know, we might think of civil war, revolutions, and whatnot. So the 3 options that I'm going to illuminate now will be rather boring ones and mostly have to do with the kind of arrangements we can put in place for managing data. This is what I had in mind. So the 3 options I articulated, and you should have listened to the entire lecture to understand where they fit in into the current condition, are as follows. We can see a world where we basically give all of our data to the likes of Google, Facebook, and big data monopolists that are currently trying to appropriate as much data as possible and then make some analysis of it, mostly in order to generate some utility for us. And yesterday I pointed out that much of that utility revolves around generating free time out of thin air. So a service like Google Now is meant precisely to get as much data as possible from various resources, analyze it on the fly, and then make your life easier and faster by making some of the decisions automatically. Right? And this is a very nice example of the kind of useful services and benefits that will happen if you permit everyday 24/7 surveillance of your life by these companies. The second option was a bunch of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley offering you the ability to basically self-monitor and collect all of the data on your own, put it up on a server where others can access it at a fee and thus make money on it yourself. So instead of deriving useful services from the likes of Google, you will instead be making cash by essentially putting this data in some kind of a bank on which you'll be constantly earning some interest. That was option number 2. And option number 3 that I articulated that was my preferred option was to think about some new kind of legal and political and social regime for data ownership, whereby we would not necessarily be thinking of the data that we generate, especially when we are out in the city and talking and communicating with our fellow citizens. We would not be thinking of it as a private property. Rather, we would be thinking of it as some kind of communal property, whereby there will be a way for us to be seen as owners of it, but we would not necessarily be able to sell that data. And that might lead to all sorts of new alternatives to Uber, Airbnb, and all of the companies that have sprung up by Silicon Valley on the data that we generate. But we would run them in a very different manner with a much more active role played by cities in a way that will not feature all of the precariousness that occurs with labor practices at Uber and other institutions. And of course, you know, there are a lot of missing steps here about the political process, how exactly that would happen. We can talk about that. But those, I think, are the three options with regards to data. And just a little footnote, again, the note on which I ended yesterday was that despite this simplification that I have just offered, it's not, of course, just about data. It's also about how the data is generated, who owns the infrastructures through which it's generated, who owns the sensors, who operates them, whether citizens actually can claim ownership of any of those resources is as big of a question as data. So there will be no way to oppose the first two options that I have outlined without a comprehensive strategy that might also reverse some processes like privatization of basic infrastructure that have been in place for the last few decades.
Yeah. Thank you. We've seen actually all three options unfolding at the moment. They're on various stages. We have the monopolistic companies that own a lot of infrastructures. We have also the promise of self-quantifiable movements that they can bank on their data output. You have even some petitions on Facebook that Facebook should actually reward the user simply for using it. The new ways of ownership are really interesting in terms of the challenges that Uber and the likes are putting forward towards traditional administrations. Airbnb, Uber are challenging the governors all over the world where they're introducing their services. They are criticized for the labor practices, the precarious labor situations people are in. You mentioned that right now. How do you see the future of labor, or what do you see? What are the possibilities? We've seen some resistance, some outcry, but I'm puzzled that there's actually so little meaningful action in addressing this new situation.
Well, I mean, I'm not puzzled. I mean, I think it's very simple. I mean, the transition from organized work in factories, which was more or less something that was covered by trade unions, towards service work and work in the service industry, which was largely deunionized, and there was no union presence with a few exceptions in places like Germany, to those practices, led to a world where any work that you're doing on a computer, which counts as service work, does not have union representation behind it. And of course, the shift towards cognitive work and what some Marxist theories would now call cognitive capitalism, or the neoliberal opponents will call knowledge society, I mean, also meant that there are no strong representations and worker representations for those entities. So, hipsters working in cafes here in London and Berlin do not have a trade union, and they don't have it not because they are silly not to think about it, but because the institutional structures that traditionally would represent them have been systematically dismantled. So that is not surprising. I mean, there have been efforts to put those institutions in place in countries where there has been still turmoil in the labor market. In Italy, there have been efforts to do that. There have been lots of campaigns over the last 15 years to make that happen, at least for the service sector, not very successfully. That said, I mean, the future of work as I see it, I mean, Uber, I think, kind of got it. And the future of work is very bleak, meaning that you will have maximum control and minimum security. I mean, I don't think that this is rocket science. I mean, you're going to get monitored very comprehensively. You're going to get your boss, and he will not be seen as, or she will not be seen as your boss, because technically they do not employ you. You're an independent contractor working for them, which is the case with Uber, who doesn't hire its drivers. But you will be subject to the most intrusive monitoring and incentive structure that will make your life quite miserable. And it will be sold to you as a means of emancipation and liberation from the 9-to-5 boring bureaucratic job that your parents had. Because now you can choose to work only 2 hours between 5 and 7 in the evening on a Saturday, and the rest of the week you can chill, which of course nobody does because everybody has to work 5 jobs and they end up driving Uber cars from 6 until midnight.
We see that. We see how the monitoring of work has been perfectionized by the likes of Amazon and in their warehouses. where the alienation of the worker, if you may say so, has taken on a completely new dimension. But I'm interested in your thoughts on why the labor movements in the 20th century were strong enough to build meaningful networks, not only in political organization, but also in the creation of, literally, the creation of meaning. And we nowadays see bubbles of outbursts on the internet where people try to organize very often with a recourse on the symbols and the shape and even the means of organization of the 20th century labor organizations, but never manifest or do not seem to manifest political action. I also think of Sloterdijk's notion of anger banks, where we could see unions in the 20th century successfully banking on the anger of the laborers and transforming this anger into political stakes and interest and actually influence. As you mentioned, the welfare state was actually just a compromise to keep the laborers quiet. On the other hand, it gave them pensions, it gave them health insurance. I do not see anything like that emerging right now in the situation.
Sure, but I mean, again, I think the answer is very simple. Why are there no anger banks? Well, because there is no anger. I mean, if there was actually active anger out there around these knowledge workers, you know, the hipsters of London will be rebelling. Like, they're not. Why are they not rebelling? Because they think they have been emancipated. And they think that the kind of work that they have now, where they have to pay 80% of their whatever salary that they're making to pay for their housing, they think that this is actually a cool and liberating environment. Like, I think this is insane, but to study this, you need a proper anthropological and sociological lens to understand how exploitation has been presented as a way to emancipate yourself from some anonymous forces like bureaucracy or standardization. I think the answer is this. It's not as if, I mean, there are, of course, occasional outbursts, and we see it every now and then. We see blips of, you know, Occupy Wall Street.
We had the Occupy movement, for instance.
Sure. But, you know, to be honest, those were not mostly knowledge workers who were in the Occupy movement. In the Occupy movement, you had a lot of people who were either mishandled by the system or who were misrepresented or who didn't have jobs. The problem that I see is that people who do have jobs and who work on these highly intelligent tasks, and who get very little security and who get a lot of exploitation, which do not see as such, because now they do not work 18 hours in the factory, but 3 of those hours they spend responding to the emails on their sofa, and they think that that counts as leisure. They think that everything is good and everything is well, and this is the new normal. I mean, that's the problem. I don't think that these people with their BlackBerries on their sofas are the ones who are then going and occupying public spaces and occupy.
So gamification, in a way, is the brave new world to go.
Well, I don't think it's gamification. I think here you have to understand the new subjectivity that has been formed by this kind of neoliberal cybernetic capitalism, which presents certain aspects of contemporary alienation and exploitation as deeply liberatory. And unless you can understand how that subjectivity has been formed and how exactly it appeals to this younger crowd, you'll not understand it, but you also will not understand the mistakes that have been made by a lot of theorists, serious theorists of cognitive capitalism, who thought that the shift toward telecommunication technologies, advanced telecommunication technologies, will actually result in more protest. If you read some of the early work of Tony Negri, for example, the most advanced Italian theorist of cognitive capitalism, who, you know, has been writing about these matters far before most media theorists have discovered it. You know, if you read his work very deeply, you will see that what he's arguing is that basically, as people move from the world of the factory, which involved a lot of manual labor, to cognitive work, we're all dealing with very advanced, sophisticated technologies of communication that lets us develop cognitive skills, communication skills, get in touch with our workers. We'll actually see much more critical thought and much more protest and much more collective action, because workers will actually no longer be just contained by these boring, mind-crushing tasks, and will be pursuing tasks that are much more analytic and critical in outlook. So these people were expecting a revolution, which didn't happen. And I think we have to understand also the pitfalls in the theory that allowed us to understand these new forms of alienation and exploitation and what exactly those people got wrong.
Negri and Hart invested quite some effort in describing the new distribution of power in empire, and we can see here how governmentality is taking on a new shape of gradual diffusion in the tiniest aspects of society. And on the other hand, they hope as a counter movement that the multitude could oppose those powers. We've seen the Occupy movement, we've seen various political movements right now in Europe that were opposing the austerity cuts. But I still have the feeling that this is something that is quickly organized through new media, social media. It's a lot of click activism and slacktivism. But the political footwork, the labor to change a political system is something we yet have to wait for.
Yes, but it also has to do with the format through which this change will be pursued. I mean, you have to understand also the historical conditions that have produced all this thought about multitude, especially in the case of Negri and Hart. I mean, in their case, you have Tony Negri, who comes out of the Italian context, and the Italian state failed way before our contemporary Northern European states now are failing. The Italian state failed already in the 70s. So Tony Negri never had any belief in the state as a vehicle of advancing any social project. Michael Hart comes from America, where it's not even on the table to pursue the state for any kind of means of social advancement since the times of FDR. So both of them, they didn't really have any nice feelings towards the state. And I think given the context of Europe and America out of which they were coming, that was not an entirely irrational attitude. That being said, Europe and America are not the only poles through which we need to analyze strategies of resistance to contemporary capitalism, including its high-tech cybernetic dimension that we're now seeing emerging from Silicon Valley. And I think that many of the ideas that I'm suggesting, for example, the idea about turning data in some kind of a communal property that will not have the private property regime attached to it, it will work much better if you were to enact it on the level of the state or on the level of the region. And by region, I mean a constellation of states. The reason why I'm not crazy enough to propose it in Europe, because I know that that's never going to happen, even that there is no European state in Europe right now that will be able to successfully take on that project, because it will just go directly against the neoliberal paradigm that most states in Europe have accepted a while ago. So the only level at which you can push for this kind of reforms would be the level of the city. That's why yesterday I was stressing the city level so much, because that's the only level at which some kind of opposition to the dominant ideology is still possible. In other places, I would say that, the multitude will be better off capturing the state. In Europe, cities is what we are left for. And then, we'll start operating at the level of neighborhoods and houses, and then, basements and and coffins and
that multitude would be something we meet in the city, on the city level. I find it interesting that you addressed the city. Another Hacking Habitat fellow in Utrecht, Saskia Sassen, also mentioned explicitly the city as something that stands out of a history of failed states defaulting on their economy and their debts, a history of corruption and not manifesting the promise of representative democracy. Why is the city the more suitable model or organization to pursue these endeavors?
Well, again, I think it's deeply historical and it's deeply original. So in Europe and America, this is probably the case. This is not the case in Latin America, in some parts of it at least, where some governments, if you look at Ecuador, if you look at Argentina, you actually have nation states that are quite to the center of the left. They're, you would say, extreme left by using European categories. But many of their capitals and cities have been captured by neoliberal elites. So both Quito and Buenos Aires have mayors that are right of center, and one of them might actually become the next president of Argentina. And that has to do with the composition of voters and people belonging to the elites and to the upper classes voting for the neoliberal whatever. So, I mean, you should also be able to historicize the thought of many European theories grappling with the collapse of the nation state and the rise of the city. I mean, what else do they have left? If you want to have discourse relevant to the problems of Europe, this is how you have to be framing your argument, because very few people will find theories that are currently attached to nation state lent along to the European Union credible. I mean, the only person who believes in the European Union as a vehicle of these things is probably Habermas. Like everybody else has already left that level of, I hope, but maybe not.
Before we're going to address the public sphere and the hope Habermas invested into it, let's open this discussion to the audience. We have a number of students here, design students, media theory students, students from culture studies, and they all will be challenged with making a difference on a personal level, but maybe also on a local level. So there might be questions concerning what design can do, what theory can do, or what an individual can do. There are people with microphones, and please raise your hand, state your name and affiliation, and ask any question you want.
Hello, I'm Vladimir. Thanks for speaking here today. I think you reached some very interesting points on how to deal with data today. I had a question.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Okay. I had a question because you seem to be criticizing quite strongly the neoliberal view and the neoliberal viewpoint and approach to data and economy, who seems to be dominant worldwide. I was just wondering, to be able maybe better to identify the problem, why are they winning the debate? Why are they so powerful today?
Sure.
I thought that might be an interesting point to bring up, so thank you.
Sure. Well, for me, again, it's not, you might say that I have a conspiratorial viewpoint, but to me, ultimately, ideologies are the products of underlying economic and political power dynamics. So it just happens that neoliberalism happens to be a doctrine that is quite congruent and conducive to the activities of global capital. So, to me, this is just a basic truth, that there is a reason why, if you look at any report produced by the World Economic Forum in Davos, they happen to spew an ideology that is immediately endorsed by hundreds of CEOs who attend the World Economic Forum in Davos. So it's very easy to basically point the finger and say that, well, the reason why this ideology rules the world is because it just reflects the beliefs of the ruling elites. And the ruling elites are not in power because, sorry to be bashing Habermas, but it's not because they won the fight for the better argument that Habermas celebrates, but because they simply hold the resources and the powers, and they control much of the agenda, including in the media, much of which they own.
Which was one of the basic fears Habermas had, that the concentration of power in the media would dominate the debate and challenge the outcomes. More questions? Over there.
Is it on? Hi, I'm Ilga, part of the Impakt organization. I was wondering, Evgeny, you were referring to, for example, London or Berlin hipsters trying to welcome actually all these new insecurities and seeing that as emancipation of sorts. I was wondering, and to quote a curator, the head of BUC here in Utrecht, Maria Lavajova, she has called the group of information workers that we are here the highest educated proletariat that ever existed. Could you respond to this idea where everybody here, a lot of the students, be it in design or at the university, who are entering this world, as well as the people who are in this sector, I feel that there's already quite some ideas to organize ourselves, but that we don't really know how to penetrate the elite and to make anything different. So rather than saying that we welcome it, I think that even if you are aware that these informational labor structures have become very difficult to live with, could you explain your views on how we could improve that position?
Sure. Well, sure. I mean, my basic philosophy always presupposes that we have to be very clear about who our enemy is before we can fight them. And my fear is that a lot of the young and talented and smart people in Europe mischaracterize the enemy. They either define the enemy in rather abstract or rather too concrete terms, and which explains why so much of our
collective efforts go into activities that, to me, do not ultimately change much in the underlying power dynamics. You know, and I travel quite a lot in Europe, and I see, you know, if you go to Paris, for example, once the kind of hotbed of radical thought and radical thinking and opposing corporations, power and whatnot, now what would radical young French people do, you know, with an exception of Tikkun and a bunch of anarchists? Like, what would they do? I mean, they would go and work on peer-to-peer collaborative economy and sharing and finding a way in which you can share your power drill with 5 of your neighbors, which has become the overarching revolutionary project of today. It's how you can use the power drill more effectively with the people who live around you. To me, that seems like a rather unambitious way to challenge the enemy, whoever the enemy is. And I would like to know how these people actually define the enemy. And if you go and start actually conducting that investigation, you'll discover that that define the enemy as some kind of a centralized, mechanized, unresponsive, extremely slow system that is also inefficient and pollutes the environment and whatnot. I mean, they define the, and some of those features are not necessarily, you know, bad. I mean, bad in the sense that they are accurate descriptions of some of the problems we have in the world. But I still don't see the economic dimension, which to me used to be the primary lens through which you will understand who sets the agenda for the rest of what's happening in the world. So, I mean, you can argue that the reason why the highest skilled proletariat cannot actually do anything about its own political agency is because being proletariat, it has also somehow managed to completely get rid of one good thing that was clearly, for me, unambiguously good about Marxism, which was the economic analysis and the primacy of the economic over other dimensions. Since that has been kind of taken off the table, we end up in the situation where we feel exploited and are exploited. But we define the enemy in terms that are not economic or political, but mostly cultural or social. And by social, I mean that we identify bureaucracy or, you know, maybe even the welfare state, which kind of, you know, sometimes favors us and sometimes doesn't, as the institutions to be fought. And I'm afraid that without recovering another lens and perspective on how to reinterpret what's happening, without actually understanding the role of elites, the role of capital, the role of banks, and trying to merge some of the movements that are already contesting their power with those movements who would like to contest the technological instantiations of that power, we will not advance very far. And I'm afraid to say I do not see many robust analysis of Silicon Valley in Europe that actually managed to speak about Goldman Sachs and Google in the same sentence. And unless they can speak about them in the same sentence, I don't think that we are actually talking about the real enemies.
I don't think they should only think in one sentence mention Goldman Sachs and Google, but also the White House. It's amazing how deeply interconnected those agencies
I mean,
are.
that's, yeah, let me just add here. I mean, and this is another dimension that has been completely lost since the end of the Cold War, and it's the fact that nobody questions anymore the fact that we are living through some kind of American century. I mean, in Europe didn't make any moves that it should have made in the early 90s to kind of rethink its position after the end of the Cold War. So nobody now, you can see it with this very timid, in my view, opposition to the trade treaties that Europe is about to sign. I mean, they generate some anger from the traditional groups like trade unions and a few others. But by and large, you can see that the political process is so broken that that anger doesn't really influence the policymakers anymore. And nobody is, let me put it that way, in a very kind of slogany kind of way. If you really want to understand and oppose Silicon Valley and the modes of exploitation that it enacts, you have to understand it as being an extension, an instantiation of American capitalism. And if Europe is not eager to question either parts of that expression, neither the American one nor the capitalist one, you will not get a critical understanding of what's happening. And as long as Europe has bought into the transatlantic agenda, and some parts of Europe clearly have, Southern Europe, by and large, parts of it, at least the critical opposition there, is still holding up. But those doors might close. And as long as there is no questioning of that kind happening, we will end up talking about power drills and, you know, better ways to share our apartments and, you know, creating some kind of fair trade alternative to Google, which I think would not be the way to resolve the problems that we currently face.
There seems to be another question.
Hi, that would be me. Hi, Mirko. Hi, Evgeny. I'd like to still address the labor structure question. I work with advertising. I'm recently freelancing, so I understand perfectly what you mean when you're referring to the mishandling of professionals and, let's say, perverse emancipation through apps, etc. But a thought that has been haunting me since I was working for these big agencies was a thing that maybe you could explain to me. By all these, let's say, collective, not only apps, but the whole viewpoint of doing things collectively, I have noticed that the individual is kind of losing his place. So all my life, I've worked with credits. I'm a creative. So a way of making my work stand out is to be able to say, hey, I did this. I did this copy, I did this campaign. And what I've experienced is that inside agencies, they are progressively telling people to unite, we'll be a, let's say, organism of people. There is no you or Margaret or Andre involved. So my question would be, is this collective bubble or P2P way of thinking something deliberately made by companies to weaken you?
Well, it's a very tricky question. I mean, in part because you can argue that if that's really the case in which advertising companies work, then we have already achieved communism of capital, because they already have no interest in attributing any individual property rights to anybody or any individual credit. They just claim that that's the product of the commune. But I think a more serious answer to this question would be that, well, I mean, I can understand the reasoning why they would do that, and you probably also, that from the point of financial, another kind of cost optimization, you would like to claim it as the work of the agency rather than individual geniuses who might then leave the firm and go elsewhere. So it's a deliberate kind of way to deflate the brands of individual creators as a way of also not creating superstars. But that aside, I can't tell you that I am all in favor of singling out individual creativity and individual genius, because this, to me, also smacks very much of the extreme hyper-capitalist model of, here is Steve Jobs, the boy genius who built Apple out of his garage, and he did it all on his own, and let's forget that much money that came to fund Apple came from Defense Department and other institutions. I mean, I don't like the story of the individual genius, and I don't think that in most cases it accurately describes the way in which innovation happens. That said, I don't want that narrative to be used to denigrate the work of individual contributors. So here I think we're just running against some kind of limits of the capitalist model. I mean, ideally, the way I would organize production is that I would just give basic income to everybody and have you come to the office if you want, contribute to the common pool, get a bonus with everybody else if you want to, and be happy. Like, I don't want to create superstars, and I don't necessarily think that people should be motivated by those kinds of incentives as opposed to incentives to improve the lives of humanity or and whatnot. But this is a very different model from the hyper-competitive model that has traditionally driven innovation in enterprises.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting what you state here, because we see actually both. On the one hand, the narrative is a genius that is pushing forward the technological agenda, but on the other hand, we see, especially on platforms like Amazon Turk, that those who are contributing to solving tasks on Amazon Turk are just reduced to a number. You just have a number.
But that's the wage relationship. I mean, that's the core of the wage relationship. I mean, you get your wage because you're a number.
Exactly, exactly.
But that's not the Amazon Turk. This is just how wage relationship has evolved historically.
No, but you don't even contact your Turkers personally. It's a very limited cooperation between the one who gives the assignment and the other one who actually fulfills the task. And the interesting thing I find here is how intellectual labor is actually divided in modules and separatedly fulfilled by a number of workers. So you have actually the assembly chain for intellectual labor now.
Well, it's just a natural sort of extension of the Taylorist model, further and further to cut out the slack from the production process. I mean, I don't want to say that it's a natural kind of evolution, because I don't believe in natural anything, but you know, it seems to me that if you were really to push the wage relationship model under highly technological conditions to its ultimate extremes, you will end up with something like the Amazon Mechanical Turk, precisely because it takes the weak humanistic points out of equation. I mean, if you were a truly sort of convinced harsh capitalist, why would you want to create any points of interaction between workers and managers? Like, you wouldn't, because it creates points of human interaction, and humans have a tendency to break down, you know, unless they are fully neoliberal zombies working for Goldman Sachs. So you would not want to have those kinds of openings, so you eliminate them, and technology gives you the ability to eliminate them perfectly.
Exactly. We'll see with automation that increasingly the humans are taking out of the equation. Amazon investing heavily into robots to get the laborers out of their warehouses because they're causing troubles all over. Yeah.
No, but I mean, but look, I mean, like, I'm a fan of automation. If you were to ask me, like, again, in my ideal world, nobody would be working. But the problem that our current capitalist systems face now is that they cannot afford not to have all those people employed, because you don't want 90% of people running unemployed in the streets, because, you know, then your system will not necessarily be as sustainable as you hope it will be.
Well, I think here kicks your idea of a basic income in, and some therapy to keep the people busy. Or
Yeah, basic income for psychoanalysts, yes.
Are there other questions? Yes, over there.
Yeah, I actually had a question about the basic income, because yesterday you also said something about it, and I was wondering what you would say about the relation of the idea of the basic income to well, the three outcome solutions that you started this talk with.
Sorry, I didn't get the last sentence. How basic income relates to the three options that I cited about data?
Yeah, like the three options of, you know, either like the Silicon Valley companies having their way, and you know, providing sort of a utopia, as a dystopia,
okay. I get it.
Or the middle one, or your solution. Like,
well, I mean, look, it's I don't know how many of you will accept this framing, but you can argue that in as much as we thought that basic income would be spent on certain basic needs, which I think is a reasonable assumption, health, education, and so forth, it might actually be the case that Silicon Valley will come around to offering some of those basic needs in kind. And I would argue that this is what's already happening with health diagnostics, some of the stuff I mentioned about Google Now, converting surveillance into time, free time. I mean, you're basically managing to get some of the basket of goods you might associate with basic income, or some of the goods that you might buy if you had a basic income, you're just getting it for free in kind already offered by those companies. In that sense, this is also was one of the insights where I started thinking about Silicon Valley from the perspective of the welfare state, because in a sense, this is what these companies already do. I mean, they offer you something that is very basic. It's not just an extra. As for the other options, I mean, I don't know, with the data that earns you money, I mean, you can argue that, you know, you can liken it to the idea of basic income, or you can liken it to the idea of prostitution. I mean, I don't know, which one would you like more? You can say that the ultimate money you'll make is by disclosing everything about yourself online, putting it on a secure server, and then having companies access it, everything, including your DNA, make money off of it by designing different ads to show you. And yeah, you'll receive 100 euros at the end of every month. I mean, I don't know whether it counts as basic income or, you know, data prostitution. I mean, I don't know. It depends on who's looking. And with regards to the third option, I mean, I think it's probably the more amenable to the idea of basic income, in that, you know, to enact that paradigm of property, of data going beyond private property, you know, that will presuppose that you can actually organize a lot of services in a manner that might be faster, cheaper, more decentralized, and that might eventually either spare up some money for something else, or it might actually not require, I mean, but again, it depends on if you want to think at the level of the nation state or originally at the level of the city. I mean, if you just do it at the level of the city, clearly you'll still be constrained by a lot of national barriers. If you want to think very ambitiously and think of a nation state embarking on that, then yes, you can start thinking about ways in which a full transition from the current capitalist model to the one where data is still very present but is run and operated on a very different principle will result in automation of many processes and will result in the economy actually growing and developing quite a lot of you know, value, and then that value will be distributed amongst people through basic income. I mean, let me put it that way.
We basically see that shift right now happening, because we see people speaking about basic income, which in parties, in political parties, where it was a taboo until now.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not, I mean, like, you have to be careful about basic income. Basic income, ever since it has been articulated almost a century ago, has always attracted two kinds of forces to it. One was the kind of extreme left, and one was extreme right. And the extreme right wanted it because they basically didn't want to have the welfare state, and they thought that it would be much better just to give people this handout and forget about any other kind of welfare. So in exchange for giving people basic income, you then also scrap free education, free health, and free everything, because you already give people basic income. The extreme left wanted to have all of those other things run outside of the market: education, health, transportation, everything else, and give people basic income, partly as a compensation for the system that will be running in an automated manner, so people will not actually need to go to work. You don't have it in the neoliberal version of basic income. This is why, you know, the CEO of Uber, if you go and read his remarks carefully, he also supports basic income. And a lot of Silicon Valley CEOs support basic income. Why do they support basic income? Because, you know, for them, it's great. If the state can take over the payments to Uber drivers, then you cannot make the argument about precarity. Then Uber doesn't have to pay them. So you have a lot of this neoliberal Silicon Valley guys going around organizing conferences on basic income. But, you know, the basic income itself is a red herring. You have to look at the institutional, legal, and economic structure behind it and who gets paid and who doesn't.
Yeah. Thank you. And over there, yes.
Hi. My name's Delaney. I'm from Amsterdam by way of the States. And I'm also have a question about, like, universal basic income, sort of. And I read somewhere online yesterday about someone asked a question, is the proletariat working ideal kind of going to destroy universal basic income, or like be the main crux against it? Just because the proletariat like mindset kind of thinks that labor equals pay and what you put in is what you get. So people don't really deserve money just for living life. And I guess I wonder just like, why do you think people started to think in a sort of proletarian mindset? Or I don't know, any response to that? And also, like, is there some sort of alternative in a like way to think about universal income?
Sure, but I mean, look, the entire premise behind this idea of life as biopolitics and life as something that contains value by means of data does presuppose that you will get paid for just living your life, because you generate a lot of value in the process of living your life, you know, and that data might be data about your health reactions to certain drugs that might then be used by drug companies, so it might be data about transportation or data that might be used by other companies to improve their service. I mean, this is the entire debate right now is about whether in the process of living our normal everyday life, we're generating value that is not by any means captured by us, but is captured by a handful of companies who then do not share the value with us and instead organize these crazy missions to conquer Mars or mine asteroids or whatever else Google and Amazon are doing. I mean, this is the argument. And in that sense, I wouldn't necessarily from scratch assume that that argument is not correct. To me, it actually sounds quite accurate, that there is a lot of value that is being generated, and as we are moving from heavy industrial production to data-intensive modes of production and organization of the economy, that will become even truer. And this is where there's demands for basic income that will be somehow rooted in this sort of data appropriation or reappropriation by the people. I think they are quite accurate. I mean, political possibility for enacting them in Europe is not any higher than it was at any point in the last 70 years since the claims for universal income and basic income have been articulated. So, I don't necessarily see it as a kind of as a slogan, but I still would want to have radical political parties to do pop up in Europe every now and then to at least put it in their program. The problem is that the two forces that did flirt with the idea of basic income in the last few years, namely Podemos and Jeremy Corbyn, both have dropped it, as far as I know, from their programs by the time they actually got to any possibility of getting elected. So they float this idea at the beginning of the cycle. They capture a lot of radical young people and economists, and they get them behind their back. By the time they get to the election booth, all of those programs disappear. I mean, this is the sad part, but at least they put it discursively on the agenda and people talk about it, which, is a good start, but it doesn't, it's great for festivals.
Well, thank you. There's another question, gentleman in checkered shirt. Will someone also done for the following? Okay.
Hello? Oh, yeah. Well, I have a question. I have two questions. The first one, Murilo, I'm from Brazil, regular Impakt attendance. I saw your lecture today, I like it very much. And when you mentioned the tentacles of the big corporations, sort of remind me of the Roman Empire. And I was thinking, do you see any limits, not ideological, of course, with some, how can I put it, technological limits to the point to which they could go, as far as they could go in our lives, in a control? Or you don't see that as a problem, that's just normal? How do you see any limits to what the power that they can...
But limits that we can impose, or limits that are just technological, because there are certain things they are not capable of.
Well, I said non-ideological, that would be that we would impose these limits in terms of technology and reach. Analogy, I was thinking, of course, you can have an application to tell you to sleep early so you won't get sick. But if you break your leg, of course, maybe you can get an application to buy a 3D printer to get a cast on your leg, but there's a limit to what technology can do. So do you see any, when you think about Google and...
Well, I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, you can argue that a lot of the apps that they're building are simply impractical, and there is a lot of stuff there that's just pure hype, and it will never get used. And I've made that critique. If you look at the subtitle of the British edition of my book, I think it's something like the quest to solve problems that don't exist, or something along those lines. So you might as well argue that a lot of the solutions that Silicon Valley and Google and others offer us, they're solutions that are framed precisely based along the technology that they have already developed, and those are neither appropriate nor the best solutions you can have, and certain problems might not even be problems. And and this is some of the arguments I've made about the importance of ambiguity and friction in everyday life, and that sometimes having opacity and sometimes having things that perhaps don't work or work in a certain manner is actually enriching and makes our life worth living. I mean, you can pursue that line of critique, and that kind of gets us closer, for those of you who were in the audience yesterday, it gets us closer to that debate we had with a woman who asked a question about artists and, Silicon Valley not having a proper view of the human condition. I mean, you can advance that type of critique. It's just that I also think that there are certain institutional forces that can make the most ridiculous and impractical ideas suddenly go viral and widespread if there is enough money put to support those agendas. And that is why I think
Could you name the institutions?
Well, I mean, but the institutions are the ones giving money and attention to it. So, if you have, certain programs inside, cities, governments, European Commission, funding certain projects that, for some of us might look ridiculous, but they have powerful backers and supporters that, do want to solve everything through, risk trackers or what have you, then, they might suddenly become much more powerful than a proper sociological and technological analysis of those apps would suggest. So, whatever attention and there is also a hype in the media now. So, anything that you organize, you go and organize a maker fair somewhere, and and then the chances are you'll get a lot of media attention because this is something that now receives a lot of hype, regardless of how commoditized and commercial the products you show they are. I'll just give you an example. 3 weeks ago, there was a big maker fair in Rome, which was, I think, Maker Fair Europe. It was actually at the national level. And it was the most commercial activity that you could possibly imagine that had very little to do with artisanal kind of underground culture. It was all the big Italian brands trying to integrate the maker culture within their kind of institutions. And they were organizing it at the University of Rome in Sapienza. And they were actually charging students from the university to attend the fair. I mean, this is the maker culture of today, which was supposed to be the link to, to all of the underground kind of, So, and there are specific forces, foundations, philanthropists, governments, cities who are funding this stuff. So this stuff does not just happen because Silicon Valley has some kind of, confusing understanding of human existence and then has a hegemony on our agenda. There are other institutions that are aligned with its vision of creative entrepreneurship that appeals to a lot of people who in the governments now cannot offer jobs to anybody, so they're more than happy to have everybody think that they're entrepreneur. Well, in fact, they're just unemployed and happen to have access to a 3D printer.
Well, it also has to do, with, of course, with the growth of digits in what they call the creative industries, where we see a faster and a bit higher growth than in the crumbling industries currently. So cities invest their hope in those
of course,
areas.
If as a nation state you let your factories
that.
collapse, I mean, yes, they'll be growing slower. Yes, I agree.
Okay. We'll take one last question before we round up this session. And that was the gentleman in the checkered shirt that is waiting for a microphone.
It works? Okay, that's fine. So I have a very hands-on question for you. I hope you can help out. I'm starting to work 1st of December on the evil side, I would say. So I will be curating the Smart City, the worldwide conference event, one of the biggest, mainly hijacked by IBM, Accenture, and etc.
The one in Barcelona, or which one?
The one that was in. No, I can't say too much. No, I know. So one was in.
They're all hijacked by IBM, so there is no danger.
No, it was in Washington, and next year it's not yet known. So, so I like the idea, or that's how I position myself there. I'll go inside, and of course I have to spend a lot of time dealing with their crap. But then I give you the room. I'm not smart enough to come up with this. Come with 10 speakers, 10 projects, 30. I can give you 50 if you want. Of projects that are that we can frame as in innovation, doing the same thing as they do. But then actually they are doing good. But I'm stuck with nothing. I heard the mayor of Madrid as a good example, mentioned yesterday. Yeah. But okay, that's one. So I'm so on top of the list. This is the first one. Could you give me other names of examples? If not concrete examples, then give me some guidance in what type of where should I be looking.
Sure. So let me first give something of a historical dimension to the crisis that the smart city is finding itself in. Silicon Valley, and that's a much broader point I would like to make now, Silicon Valley operates constantly by producing new buzzwords to coin and give birth to trends. Great, but the way in which they work is by basically denying that there is some consistency in our historical development. Instead of trying to work within some overarching narrative, they would rather splice up that narrative into a series of unrelated ones. So every 5 years, or every 2 years, depending on the field, they have to come up with a new buzzword that tells a new story that is itself presented as a historical without any prior connections to what came before. You can track the same kind of efforts around big data, Web 2.0, now the smart city, but also the Internet of Things, and a lot of other 3D printing also, which is presented as something that happened in the last 10 years, while the history of 3D printing has, a 40-year history of various plants and other various forms of manufacturing giving us what we have now. The same story, I would argue, would apply to the story of the Internet itself. This is why I myself do not even use that term. I find it extremely confusing. When you look to the smart city, what's presented to us as the smart city right now is a paradigm that is claimed to have emerged in the last 10 years or so, which involves a bunch of companies who are stepping in and are trying to, by taking over some of the infrastructure, by building it from scratch and keeping it in public hands, that are trying to make cities run more efficiently and effectively, and in a more interactive manner, blah, blah. You can throw in all of this interactivity on top of it. But ultimately, the story that they're telling can be told with a very different and much longer narrative, and that narrative will be the narrative of privatization, which, of course, none of these players would want to tackle because it will immediately sound political and will immediately create a lot of resistance to what they're doing from the movements that have existed within cities for a very long time. And many of them have been defeated, but some of them have not. This is why yesterday, when I was presenting, I did specifically mention efforts to remunicipalize some of the services that have been taking place in many European cities for quite some time. It happened in Hamburg. There was somewhat of a failed effort in Berlin. And I'm talking about infrastructure. This is not the infrastructure of the smart cities. We're talking about infrastructure like water, like electricity, like basic facilities that help us run the city. And if you will manage to build bridges between campaigns that are deeply political and economic, and that target the remunicipalization of infrastructure, and even the process of remunicipalization, if you look at it, has a much longer history stretching back 100 or more years, and you'll find plenty of examples in Vienna and other places where remunicipalization, meaning bringing services and platforms and activities under the management of the city and under the management of the public and the citizens, have actually been successful. So that would be the first various thing that I would do, would be to completely deny the consistency of the narrative that big technology companies are putting in front of us, and try to find other alliances with other efforts that contest the imposition of this linear, more effective, privately run infrastructure on cities. And then, once you have accepted that, you can go and look for specific developments. I mentioned that project in Helsinki yesterday, for example. It's called Katsu Plus, and that's an effort to build an Uber-like decentralized alternative built by the city. Even in Barcelona, in addition to all of the stuff they're doing to oppose the smart city, they have also taken very active steps to do something against Airbnb. I mean, this is also, for me, something that has to be analyzed together. We should not be splitting our analysis into this discursive chunks where 5 people are thinking about the smart city and 5 people are thinking about the sharing economy. Ultimately, both of them attempt to do the same, which is to run the city more effectively and more efficiently with a neoliberal paradigm behind it. This is what Airbnb wants to do. They want to take advantage of all the free beds, spaces, houses that are available in the city in a way that is not really that different from the paradigm of the effective use of resources that the smart city wants to impose. So my advice to you can only be think as holistically as possible and use some kind of a, detector, if you will, to identify what are other efforts that might be united along the meme of, right to the city or, whatever has happened to it. I mean, we see plenty of protests in the cities of people contesting various aspects of what's happening in Brazil, in Istanbul, and, all over the place. And unless we manage to link those active, vibrant public protests and contestations that are happening to the protests that I agree with you, do not exist around the smart city, we will not get very far. But do not operate on the terms that Silicon Valley throws at you. I mean, reject them and build alliances with other players.
I promise I will do that.
Well, that's a great guiding line. I think we all expect, and we all here expect invitations to that event. I would like to thank Evgeny for being here and answering the questions from the audience. I would like to thank the audience for being here and presenting such stimulating questions. And I assume there's a bar open and awaiting further discussion under the consumption of a few drinks. Thank you all. Thank you, Evgeny.
Thank you.